Thank you all very much for joining us here for the power of branded podcasts, which is it is a very hot topic. It is something that certainly it sounds profitable. We get an awful lot of email about, a lot of questions about. It seems like every time I give a talk somewhere, I'm getting a lot of questions about branded podcasts and what they can do and why you would do such a thing and who would want such a thing. Well, the answer is you have very good reasons to do it. And there are very good reasons why you should do it if you consider all the things that we're going to talk about here today. So I am Tom Webster, obviously a partner at Sounds Profitable, and I am joined today by two very special guests. First of all, today's webinar is brought to you in partnership with Jar Audio, who is a very fine purveyor of branded podcasts and branded podcast strategy and a partner of Sounds Profitable. And from Jar, I am joined by Liz Hames, who is the director of audience growth, which is a title I had in my past at one point or another. So, Liz, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Very happy to be here.
And then also another special guest, Jar Audio and Amazon partner on a branded podcast called This is Small Business. And we're joined today by Andrea Marquez, who is the senior producer and host of that podcast, This is Small Business. And she's going to add some perspective on just exactly what they're doing there and what the goals and the kind of what success smells like and things like that. So Andrea, welcome from Houston.
Hi Tom, happy to be here.
So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, or I think Liz, maybe for you this morning. It is you live in my past and I in your future. The way that
yes, coming from Victoria today.
Coming from Victoria, yeah, and I'm in Boston, so we are truly intertranscontinental of some variety. So I've got some brand new data to show today about the people for whom branded podcasts might in fact be the most successful. But of course, branded podcasts can reach beyond that sort of inner ring of brand fans, which is what we're going to talk about. But before we kind of dive into that, Andrea, I want to start with you. Tell us a little bit about This is Small Business and why you're involved with it, why you wanted to get involved with branded podcasting, and what were kind of your goals at the outset. Just tell us a little bit about the show.
So personally, I've always been a content producer. I've been working with video content, radio. I was in broadcast radio as well. And previously, I also had another podcast called Latinx. I helped consult on producing other podcasts for my past companies. But then moving into Amazon, one of the big reasons I joined the team was because under Amazon Retail, we didn't have an owned podcast when I first joined. And so I was having an opportunity to do something completely new. And to me, that was very exciting. I didn't know how much it would be once I joined, but it's been so fun. It's been a learning experience every day, as with branded podcasts, you might all know. So why we decided to do something like This is Small Business is because obviously we recognize that podcasting is a way to deepen connections with different audiences through meaningful conversations, especially when you think about listener behavior and how there's a certain level of intimacy when it comes to podcasts as a medium. And because of that, we wanted to create a show that provided real value. So we wanted entrepreneurs, specifically aspiring entrepreneurs, to be able to turn to our podcast for inspiration, guidance, and a sense of community. And so in the first years since starting This is Small Business, I've learned that it goes back to the story rather than selling. We're telling a story, especially when you think about branded podcasts. And of course, you have to have this justification for the resources you put behind that. But it always goes back to the same thing, right? Who are you speaking to and what is the story you're trying to tell? So the goal with This is Small Business was to tell the stories of small business owners while also providing useful insights, tangible takeaways for listeners, many of whom are early stage business owners.
And Liz, as a part of your role for audience development, when you approach a podcast like This is Small Business or any of the branded podcasts that you've worked on, if you wanted to do a podcast about the Seattle Mariners and you just called it, two people talking about the Seattle Mariners, there's your show. not so easy to do with a branded podcast. So, how do you approach the initial design of a branded podcast? What kind of, research and/or strategic process do you go through to actually get to where you want to go there?
Yeah, well, branded podcasts, unlike a lot of other podcasts, are a little bit different because we're working with certain parameters in mind. One is our audience and their needs and their desires, and the other is the brand and their goals and what they want to get out of creating this show. So we keep both of those top of mind when we're developing the show itself. And where we start is really looking at, well, what are your brand goals and who do we need to target, and what action do we need them to take in order to serve those goals? Like in order for you to get out of it what you want to get out of it as a brand. So we start with the audience. We take a look at who they're trying to reach, but really zero in on in an sub audience within that audience. Just try and get as specific as possible. So I ask brands to imagine a real person in your life, someone who you think that this podcast should be for. Who are they? What do they need in their life? What desires do they have? And then how can we make a show just for them that only you could make as a brand, that's going to really showcase your superpowers as a brand, your best qualities, and is going to help them at the same time. So very much similar to what Andrea was talking about, identifying, trying to create a show of value for a specific group of people. And one of the best ways that we find to do that is to find a real connection point with our audience, because at the end of the day, we're people talking to people, which is one of the things that I really love about podcasts for brands. Is it's a way to humanize a brand. Like Andrea is the human face of This Is Small Business. She's a real person. She's lovely, and audiences really connect with her in a way that they might not be able to connect with Amazon more broadly, which is something that's really beneficial for a lot of brands. And so in my strategy sessions with my clients at the very beginning during development phase, we're talking about a very specific person with a specific person in mind, and then trying to find that connection point, that moment in their life or their day where they really need to hear from you, and what you have to say, and then building a show around that. And that's what we found really works when it comes to creating a show that's going to grow steady, and consistently, but really in a meaningful way where listeners are truly engaged with the content.
So we've adopted that here on this webinar, because we have designed this webinar especially for you, especially for the over 500 people that registered for this. So thank you for such a great reaction and turnout to this. So we're going to start by looking at some new data that we have not released yet. Before I do that, two quick things. First of all, this report and the recording of this will be available after we are done, maybe an hour or so. We have to do a little bit of magic. And as people that have registered for this, you will be the first to receive it, so you can lord it over your neighbors who don't have it yet. And I encourage you to do that. Second, if you have questions, by all means, chat in the chat. But if you have questions, please put them in Q&A, and I will try to get some done here at the end. If they're in chat, they go by very, very quickly, and I don't see them. I did see a question about gauging the ROI of a branded podcast. Be sure to get to that one. But otherwise, if you could put them in Q&A, and we'll get to them as we can. But as promised, I've got some data to show for you, and we're going to talk about this a little bit as we press on here today. So today we are going to talk about the power of branded podcasts, again, brought to you in partnership with our friends at Jar Audio, who also partner with Amazon on This Is Small Business. And all of this data is extracted from the Podcast Landscape, which is the largest publicly available study of podcast consumption behavior and the audience. We've been publishing data from this for the past several months now. And I want to acknowledge all of the other fine companies that helped to make this significant study possible: Wondery, BetterHelp, NPR, ESPN Podcasts, Libsyn, American Public Media, Paramount, and SXM Media, and of course, our fielding partners at Signal Hill Insights. So the methodology for this, as I mentioned, it's the largest publicly available study of podcast consumption in the United States. So over 5,000 Americans 18 plus who were asked about all kinds of different media habits, including their podcast consumption habits. And it was weighted to the US Census data, the most recent US Census data, so that it is representative and projectable to the US population. So I want to talk a little bit about the audience profile of the people who really potentially gravitate to branded podcasts. And I want to do it in the context of this question, which blew my mind. We asked people a series of different types of podcasts and asked them how likely would you be to listen to it? Very likely, somewhat likely, neither, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely. And just going across here, the first one, a podcast about a favorite TV show or movie, then a podcast produced by a favorite TV show or movie, a podcast hosted by a favorite celebrity or creator, and then a podcast about a favorite brand or product. And I show you this slide because a podcast about a favorite brand or product is nearly as high as a podcast hosted by a favorite celebrity or creator from another medium, right? So we're not talking about a very niche concept here because people love brands. And just as people have favorite celebrities and people have favorite TV shows, everybody has at least one brand that they're very passionate about. And I will also point out that this question was asked of the entire sample, not just podcast listeners, but the entire sample of Americans 18 plus. And I'll show you the breakdown of that here in just a moment. So as you can see, 43% said they would be very or somewhat likely. For the purposes of today, I wanted to narrow in on those very likelies, the 15% who said they would be very likely. And, that's an extraordinary thing, right? You're given a choice, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and you pick 5 on your likelihood to consume a podcast about your favorite brand or product. It's very likely you had a brand or product in mind when you answered that. So again, with a sample of 5,071 Americans, that 15% is a significant sample size. And so we're really able to kind of break that down a little bit. First question they get asked relevant to podcasting is, when was the last time, if ever, that you consumed a podcast, either audio or video? And you'll see nearly 6 in 10 are weekly podcast consumers. But the thing I want to point out on this graph, it's kind of extraordinary, actually. Again, this is asked of everybody, even non-podcast consumers. And 8% of the people who said they would be very likely to listen to a podcast about a favorite brand or product have actually never listened to podcasts. Think about that for a moment. We often think about branded podcasts as a way to amplify a brand. They also could be a way to continue to spread the reach of podcasting. If you reach brand fans and people that have a certain relationship with a brand that maybe haven't discovered a podcast yet, but if it was a podcast about their cult product, the suitcase that they love, the motorcycle they ride, whatever, that actually might pull them to listen to podcasts, which I think is fairly extraordinary. A couple of things about demographics. First of all, if you look at brand fans here, again, that 15% were very likely to listen to a podcast about a brand or a product. They're pretty young, right? If you want to reach young consumers, a branded podcast is an exceptional angle to do that. 37% are 18 to 34, and another 41% are 35 to 54. So they're younger than the US population. And in terms of gender balance, and I find this one interesting as well, they're close to the population. And the reason why that's interesting is because monthly and weekly podcast consumers actually lean more male. It's closer to closer to 60-40 when you get to really active listeners of podcasts. So again, the brand fan, that person who might even be led to podcasting by content about a favorite brand, they're actually closer to the US population, which means they lean a little bit more female than the average regular podcast consumer. I also want to point out here the diversity of brand fans, and especially with Hispanic Latino consumers, they index very highly as brand fans. 17% of the US population are Hispanic Latino identifying, 27% of brand fans are. And you can also see higher percentages here for Black African American consumers. And of course, you see white and Asian American on here as well. So brand fans in general, they're more diverse, they're younger, a little more female leaning than the podcast audience in general. So Liz, I'll pose this question to you first. Do you see, every branded podcast is different, of course, but do you see that kind of diversity in your own data, podcast to podcast? Do you see signs that different branded podcasts are in fact pulling very different audiences like this.
Yeah, I see it all over the map. I've seen some shows that are like almost 100% male, some shows almost 100% female, and then, a mix of them all. I would say um, my advice for brands would just be to lean into your niche, whoever your brand draws in most naturally, lean into that rather than trying to create a show specifically for this demographic that's represented here. Just do what you do best and talk to the people who want to hear from you most.
And Andrea, just out of curiosity, without you don't have to give any data here, but what is your sense of your audience when who do you feel is listening to the show that is sort of gravitating to this content week after week, and how do you kind of get that vibe?
So rather than feel, like what our data has shown also is, yes, I mean, it reflects a lot of what you're showing here. Our audience is younger, diverse, and it skews slightly female, which aligns with what you're saying. And I feel, to what Liz just said, it makes sense when thinking about who our podcast is speaking to, which is aspiring entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurship. And when you think about how entrepreneurship is growing among women and how we're continuously looking for resources that feel relevant to us. So that's absolutely something that we think about too when creating our stories, making sure that we build a show that attracts a range of listeners with different experiences, but knowing that it's going to land somewhere specifically. And for now, it has been skewing slightly more female, which it changes, it comes and goes, but I would say it aligns with what you've been saying.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's also some simpatico with the host there as well when you look at some of these demographics,
Absolutely.
and that's only natural. So, well, good. So that's sort of the demographic makeup of brand fans. These highly charged, highly activatable audience segments for branded podcasts. I also want to look at their general media consumption, and again, brand fans aren't all podcast listeners, right? This is with all Americans 18 plus. We gave them a whole bunch of different media channels and asked them what they're spending more time with. And not surprisingly, as we've seen in some of the other cuts of this particular data set, visuals are really important, right? YouTube is at the top here in terms of spending more time with, TikTok second, and Instagram third. Podcasts, luckily, are up there. That's not a guarantee. It's certainly good to see that over half of brand fans say they're spending more time with podcasts. So, what are they spending less time with? And this is really, I think, a key into this segment of Americans who I think are becoming harder and harder to reach with traditional, interrupt style advertising. What are they spending less time with? At the top, AM/FM broadcast radio, AM/FM streaming radio, network and cable TV, right? Those sort of traditional interrupt advertising style media channels. And again, luckily, podcasts are very near the bottom of this list. So we know that we're dealing with a fertile segment when we're doing branded content and branded podcasts. So when we're looking at this, though, what they're spending less time with, we are looking at an audience that through a lot of other means are getting more and more difficult to reach, I think. So Liz, I'll start with you. Obviously, we have to reach this audience somehow to tell them about the fact that there's a branded podcast that they might be interested in. What are some of the ways that we can reach this audience and really spread the word about branded content?
One of the best ways is through other podcasts. And we've experimented with a lot of different forms of advertising and marketing and promotion, and podcast to podcast ad campaigns are the most efficient and most effective that we've seen, especially when it comes to media spend, or partnerships that sort of mimic podcast to podcast ad campaigns. So cross promotions or other co-marketing opportunities where, say, your host, maybe Andrea, is a guest on another podcast and they come on as a guest on our podcast. So those kinds of opportunities, from these kinds of campaigns, we see new what I call, or not me, but sticky listeners come to the show. So these are people who come to the show, they listen once and they sample, and then they come back because they like what they heard, and they listen to multiple episodes again and again. So those are the kinds of listeners that we definitely want to see more of, rather than people who are sampling, leaving, and then never coming back. But people who are going to stick around, maybe share it with a friend, maybe follow the show, maybe engage with the show in some way. So podcasts are still like the best way that I've seen to help new listeners find the show.
And Andrea, what's the brand's role in that? How can the brands themselves get involved with helping to, market your own marketing, basically? How are some of the ways that you reach prospective new listeners with the brand on your side?
I mean, Liz said it perfectly. I think whenever I have this topic come up, I always say start with it, meet them where they are. The podcast listeners are probably already listening to another podcast. So you want to leverage that space. Of course, there's other spaces that you want to leverage, because in order to get to a position where you're top of mind or your word of mouth recommendations, there needs to be this sense of repetition. So obviously you want to leverage what already exists with the brand, right? Social media, short form content video, cross promotions with brands and relevant spaces. And I think for brands specifically, the role is to facilitate discovery. So yes, obviously that's through marketing, but I also think that it's about how you can make a show a natural extension of what an audience already engages with. So this is because as audiences, we're really savvy and you can totally tell when you're being sold to. So specifically also when thinking about branded podcasts, I think the best ones are the ones that put storytelling at the forefront and value, so they don't feel like marketing. And one approach to think about is partnerships that make sense, along with what Liz has been saying, right? But you want to align with other voices, creators, and communities that already have this credibility with this audience, especially if your brand already has this through other contents and formats, right? So the key obviously is to work backwards from the listener. Who are you engaging with? What kind of content do they naturally gravitate towards? And if a branded podcast can fit into the world in a way that feels relevant and meaningful, then it just moves. It's just another piece of content that people actually want to invest their time in and stay for the long run.
Super. So we also ask people what device they use most often for podcast consumption. A little bit higher with the Apple iPhone. That actually has a lot to do with the age of the brand fan. It's probably a trailing variable for that. And as you might guess, the service they say they use most often is YouTube. That's a little bit higher than the podcast population in general. It reflects what we just saw in terms of the media that they're using more often, which again, from the top are YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. And when you ask them how long they've been consuming podcasts in general, it's actually they're actually a little bit more recent to the medium than the average podcast fan is. The larger blocks here are 1 to 2 years and 3 to 5 years, and also a healthy amount here, 6 to 11 and less than 6 months. So they're likely to be more recent converts to podcasting. And here's what's attracting them. And some of these numbers are all really a little bit higher than the average podcast listener in general, starting right at the top with comedy being the leading genre for these brand fans to attract them to podcasting. And I don't, so this is small business. It's not a comedy show, very entertaining, but not a comedy show. So I'll ask a question, Andrea, to you this way. How did you establish the tone? Because there are any number of tones that really a B2B podcast could have, even a B2C podcast, anywhere from, serious to snarky. We try not to be either one here at Sounds Profitable. But so how did you establish the tone of the show, and how does that sort of express itself?
I'll start with saying, Tom, the many days, and Liz knows this, that I wish that I was a natural born comedian. It's every day. I wish that I was just like naturally funny, because to me, humor and comedy is queen. It is so important. And how, obviously this is small business, not a comedy podcast. But I think the way that translates for us to answer your question in terms of tone is to take into account the power of humor and authenticity in our storytelling. And that comes from a place of who I am as a host as well. And I know the word authenticity gets thrown out a lot. I hear it in almost every conversation when it comes to content creating, but it's for a reason. And I think it's because you can tell when something is being true to, or someone is being true to themselves or not. And when you think about branded podcasts, they do come with the added challenge of balancing authenticity with corporate messaging, because there's multiple internal layers involved in the production process. So there is that risk of content feeling overly polished or structured, which impacts the relatability to listeners. So I think that the key when we work on this as small business is to find that right approach to retain both brand alignment while also being engaging and feeling natural and being natural. And so whether it's comedy, in our case, small business, or any other topic, when it comes to branded podcasts, it has to stay as authentic as possible to the audience. And that really takes work and finessing, and also thinking about who are the people who are speaking, who are the people behind the mic, right? Not just your host, but who are you bringing on as guests as well. And that helps you finesse and reach a tone that makes sense both for what you're trying to do and for the listener that you're trying to reach.
I think the word authentic gets tossed around a lot and misused. I think people often interpret it as, you're unfiltered, you're raw, whatever. When I'm doing these webinars, I don't swear. Now, off the air, I might curse like a sailor. But my not doing that here is actually me being authentic to what my job and my goal is, right? It like being authentic to me is doing the best job I can on this webinar, and thinking about how it's going to be received. And what's authentic to me is wanting to be received well, right? So I think that sort of, unfiltered take on what authentic means often gets misused. But Liz, looking at this, are we going to see a bunch more comedy branded podcasts, or is that a red herring for us?
I think it really depends. Like, if you're not a naturally funny brand, please don't try and be funny. Please don't start a comedy podcast. It's just not going to work well for you. I think this point about authenticity is really important. Like, if it feels natural to your brand, yes, like people love comedy podcasts. It's a great way to step into a space that is currently not being well served when it comes to brands. But if that is not you, just please don't. I don't know if it would go well for anyone, but certainly every brand has like one special thing, like one piece of themselves that really feels like them. And that's what I would encourage them to lean into. And Andrea, you are funny. I have heard you be very funny. So it's not that you're not, but you also feel very much like yourself on the show, which I think is why people really connect to you and to that show. So that is where success lies with all podcasts, but especially with brands. I think the bar to be a little more human is even higher with brands, because the risk of feeling like an ad is so high, and people can sense that in authenticity, and that the fact that it's just a brand talking about their products or services. So to have a real person there that's feeling like a real person is so, so important.
And I want to point out that this webinar is brought to you by Jar Audio and Sounds Profitable. Thanks for listening. So why do brand fans listen to podcasts, or what are the top benefits that they perceive? A long list here. The thing that I'll point out is that there's a lot of, I think, a couple things that are extremely high on here. Learn about new hobbies is way higher than it is with the podcast audience in general. I take that as a sign of curiosity. And again, we've already seen through the other data that we've looked at that this is a very activatable and activated audience, right? So there's an inherent curiosity to them that I think makes them, I don't want to use the word malleable, but I'll say very receptive and open to the idea of new content and new content about brands. But then you also see things like something to listen to in the car or while traveling, or audio to keep me company. The real companion benefits of podcasting, the kind of take me with you, be a friend when you're home alone or when you're driving. And I think those are good things to keep in mind when you're creating a branded podcast, that you're also you're creating a companion, you're creating an entertainment, you're creating something that might possibly be occupying somebody when they're alone, but they're not exclusively alone. We're going to get to that in a moment. Well, let's get to it now, in fact. This is, I think, one of the most significant findings in this deck. How often do you listen to podcasts with other people, or what we call in the business jargon, co-listening? And brand fans are massively more likely to do this than podcast consumers in general. 12% of podcast consumers say they do this always or most of the time. For brand fans, it's 26. And again, it's a pretty large sample of brand fans. Then you throw in another 31% occasionally. Brand fans, more than half the time, more than half of brand fans are telling us that they at least occasionally listen with other people, which is a force multiplier. So again, we saw earlier that branded podcasts in general could be a force multiplier for podcasting because they could potentially attract people who aren't even currently podcast consumers. We also see here that they're very likely to be listening with one and generally two other people, whether that's in the car or at home. So again, that's another kind of force multiplier, both for podcasting, but also potentially for the brands. And these people are getting recommendations. They're getting personal recommendations. They're also learning about new shows on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, and searching on the internet. And a lot of times searching on the internet isn't find me a podcast about, but it is searching for a celebrity, searching for potentially a brand. And when that podcast shows up, then it's something that could potentially consume, right? But we do see YouTube and social media here being real drivers. These are also not only co-listeners, but ambassadors. They're ambassadors for podcasting, potentially, again, ambassadors for brands that support their favorite podcasts. Do people in your social circle ever recommend podcasts to you? Well, brand fans, 74% say yes. Non-brand fans, that's 56%. And again, for those who say, do you ever recommend podcasts to people in your social circle? 76% of brand fans say yes, compared to 54% of non-brand fans. So we've just seen here really that these brand fans, they're highly likely not only to recommend podcasts to others, but also to co-listen to podcasts with others. So Liz, again, I'm going to start with you. How can brands and producers work together to encourage some of those behaviors to both activate the show, but also activate the brand?
Yeah, I think this starts in the strategy phase and doing enough enough research to try and find where you might be able to stand out in the podcasting space. I keep trying to encourage the clients to get more into kids podcasting as sort of a side door to their parents. Because we are seeing data like co-listening being very overrepresented in the kids podcasting space. And I myself am a parent of two small kids, and there's just not enough screen-free entertainment out there for kids, especially shows that I also want to listen to. My 4-year-old loves Blippi's podcast, and I cannot stand it. So I would love an alternative that we could listen to together, especially, at bedtime or in the evenings. So I think there is a great opportunity here to reach not just like what you would imagine if you're advertising on a kid's podcast, you would be targeting children, but actually their parents are in the room, their kids are listening with them. And I think the opportunity for producers when it comes to creating content is thinking, how do you make this an experience that parents and their kids can have together, so that they can have the shared experience and deepen their connection, which really does solve a problem for parents, and it really does solve a problem for kids as well, because we are all looking for more ways to connect as a family, and for especially screen-free entertainment. So I think looking for ways that you can recognize and pay attention to the fact that there are multiple people listening, parents and kids, and then bringing both of them together to, maybe solve a mystery or a trivia question that you need both a parent and a child to answer, to participate in. I think there's a huge opportunity there.
I completely agree, and I'm also the owner and operator of a child, and my son's in college now. But the thing that I recall the most about kind of growing up and trying to get him into podcasting because that's what put him through college is was content for tweens. There's like such a seeming gulf between content for like really little kids, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're listening to and watching adult stuff. But I absolutely agree with you that I think that's a tremendous opportunity, especially given the co-listening data that we've seen. Andrea, anything you want to add to that about ambassadorship, evangelism, or co-listening?
Yes, I think per usual, Liz said everything beautifully. But I did want to add two things specifically because when I think about it from the perspective of being a book lover, I love books, I love reading, and I love posting about it. And I started posting about it 10 years ago. And the reason I bring that up is because I remember feeling a little frustrated that like I wanted to have a conversation about the thing I loved and had nowhere to have that in a quick, accessible way. And also to share it, right? There wasn't TikTok back then, right? And then fast forward to today, and now it's so easy to not just talk about books, but that specific book and that specific character. And there's like all of these places that are so easy to get to. So I think when you, using that as an example, branded podcasts, I think there's two ways to facilitate that ambassadorship from your listeners. One is facilitating those spaces to be able to have these conversations where people can talk about the thing they love in great detail. And then the second one is something like super specific, which is that share button is so important. What is going to get someone to click on that share button is something I'm always thinking about in the sense of not like baity, but like, what is this like important moment that tells people what they need to know about the podcast and why this is important to them? How can you get to them and make that moment shareable to then lead to word of mouth? And I think if you're able to get to a position where anyone is talking, like you just brought up, people are bringing up this thing in conversation naturally, that's how I think you're able to activate advocates and where a real brand can turn audience engagement to, right? So facilitating those conversation spaces and having a good strategy for those shareable moments.
Super. So I'm going to wrap up with just a few last pieces of data here and sort of in keeping with what we've been talking about. 88% of brand fans say they're likely to listen to a podcast that's been recommended to them. So again, I think there's potential here for tremendous activation, especially if people share an interest in a brand and somebody can share with them a podcast that speaks to that sort of love or that cult status or just interest that they have in a particular brand. We also know that brand fans are really fans of podcasts. 44% of brand fans say that they are avid fans of podcasts. This is amongst podcast listeners, by the way, who are brand fans. So they're fans of the medium. So they're likely to talk about it. They're likely to be activated. And the last piece of data that I want to show you here, this is sort of different from the very first question that we started with. Does a company's involvement make you more or less likely to try a new podcast? And this is really a piece of corroborating data. It's a check on that first question. 36% say they're much more likely, and another 33% somewhat more likely. That's 7 in 10 who say that a brand's involvement actually makes them more likely to try a new podcast. That could be interest in the brand. It could also just be a mark of quality, that if a brand is invested in it, that there's a certain bar of quality that that production or that podcast is going to meet. And I've highlighted here that people who say they're much less likely, that's 0%, right? So what we're dealing with here is an audience they're not cynical, they're not unreceptive, they're not avoidant of branded content and even advertising. They're actually very receptive to it, especially when it's about things that they care about. And in many cases, that thing that they care about is in fact a brand, right? So, going to get to a couple of questions here in a moment, but just to wrap all of this up, the brand fan is they're young, they're diverse, they're potentially a growth vector for podcasting. They often use YouTube for podcast consumption and discovery. We know from a lot of the other data that we've collected that people will go back and forth depending on their mood and mode and context. They're ambassadors and evangelists for both brands and the medium, and they see the involvement of a brand as a mark of quality, as a sign that this podcast is potentially worth their time because it's going to meet some bar that they have for level of quality or content quality, right? So all of these things make this segment of humans in America extremely receptive to branded podcasts and make them potential ambassadors and activators for branded content. Before we get to questions, I want to mention that the next significant study we're going to come out with is brand new. It's that just came out of the field. It's another very significant study of over 5,000 Americans called The Advertising Landscape, our next big fielding. It's really all based on advertising receptiveness and effectiveness. And we're looking at all media channels here, not just podcasting. And we're going to start talking about that at Evolutions by Podcast Movement. So if you're there in Chicago, I'll be giving a keynote where I'm going to be looking sort of at a high level here of podcasting's place in the advertising landscape. I want to take a few questions now. So I'm going to pop on my little Q&A box and see what I have here. I'm going to start. This is a question that I alluded to at the very beginning. What ROI can you generate from branded podcasts? And of course, I guess the ancillary question to that is, how do you measure such a thing? So Liz, I'm going to throw that one to you. How does JAR look at the ROI of a branded podcast, and what are some of the metrics and things that you look at?
Yeah, well, we look like I think the industry is trending more away from downloads and more toward engagement metrics like consumption rates and like followers. So a consumption rate is something you can find on Apple Podcasts or even Spotify, and that's the percentage of time on average that people are listening to an episode. And we aim for somewhere between like 70 or even 80%, depending on the show itself. If we're hitting that mark consistently, we know that people are really enjoying the content. Those are people who are more likely to return to the feed, to listen to more of what we have to say, who are like more likely to follow the show. So those forms of engagement are something that we look at. But when it comes to what brands want to know, one of the things that we hear people's ears perk up at is just the number of minutes on average that people are spending with your brand for every episode. So I have some clients who are, they're averaging like 40 minutes or more. People are listening, spending with their brand for each episode, and they have sometimes thousands of people listening. So that can really add up in terms of time spent listened. And if you compare that to something like, say, social media or YouTube, there's a huge, huge difference there. The amount of time and really deeply engaged time that people are spending with your brand is enormous and like very meaningful. You can use that to, if you know, for example, how much it costs you to produce an episode, you can also look at, the amount of money per minute of attention that it costs you or that you've earned with every episode. So there are ways to sort of look at it, especially if you're looking at, say, the lifetime value of a customer. If you can know how many engaged listeners you have developed around your show, and then approximately how much a new customer would create in terms of lifetime value, you can get a sense of how much that show has earned you, because we know from studies like what you guys put out or from like Signal Hill that consideration among people who are deeply engaged with the show is significantly higher than people who have not heard the show. So branded podcasts improve consideration. that means that they're more likely to move down the funnel and become a customer. So there are quite a few metrics that we're looking at, that we're exploring, and yeah, that we examine every day.
So here's a question that was asked in a couple of different ways. One by Clay, thank you, and one by Wes in the Q&A box. Um, and I'm sure, Liz, you have seen this, and maybe Andrea, you've experienced this somewhere down the line. Uh, I'm sure that you have worked with brands that want to be more overt in their sales messaging in such a thing, right? How do you draw the line in that? What is, and I know there's no sort of hard and fast line, but how do you communicate with brands and explain to them what that line is? Because I'm sure you've undoubtedly worked with people who just want a branded podcast to just be, you know, pretty much a nonstop ad for their brand. And you also know how well that would go over. So, what is that line? How do you draw that? How do you communicate that? And that's really for both of you.
Did you want to jump in, Andrea?
Take it away, Liz. I'm pretty sure you're going to say it much better than I will.
Well, I will say that, yeah, I have worked with brands that have a very light brand touch, and those brands have been consistently more successful than brands that do have a heavy hand when it comes to their branding. When it's, a company that wants to talk almost exclusively about their products or services, or have only guests from their own company on the show without offering a lot of extra or additional insight. It very much depends on the brand. Some brands are, people are drawn to them because of their unique insights. And in those instances, it might work. But I have seen brands go from a lighter brand touch to a heavier brand touch because they just want to see how it works. And the results have been that people do drop off more quickly, engagement lowers. And when they've pivoted away from that, often the best approach to find like maybe some middle ground is to offer something that's maybe a bit more of a gift. So instead of saying, hey, check out this product of ours that's somewhat related to the content we're talking about, instead, you could say something like, thank you so much for listening. We have a special offer for you guys. Go to this website to go check it out. So it feels more like a gift, more natural, and more like a thank you for being a listener for our podcast. So I think there's a line to walk. I always encourage brands to have the lightest brand touch possible, because we've seen that is what works.
Tom, and just to add also, because I was looking at some of the questions, and one of them is like kind of tied to this, like how do you talk about this internally from the brand perspective? Very forwardly, I'm always like, let me just show you. Let me show you. Let's do 2 episodes. One episode is going to be the way you want it and the way you envision it, and will, be brand heavy. And then the other one's going to be the way we suggest. And let's look at the data and let's take it from there based on what we see. And the one with less branding is usually the one that does better.
Yeah, no doubt. I'll field a couple of quick ones here. Felicia asks the stats of why they're listening to podcasts, or the top benefits. Were we focused on brand fans or total podcast users in general? That was focused on brand fans. So if there were a couple that showed total podcast as a comparison or contrast, that was not one of them. That was all brand fans. And anonymous attendee, thanks for speaking out, Anonymous. Is Canada too small for these kinds of in-depth studies? Absolutely not. First of all, I'll point out that this giant study was fielded by our Canadian fielding partner, Signal Hill Insights. Thank you for being on here. But no, and they are also producing a lot of branded research, and I know that they do work with JAR, and they do work with a lot of brands in Canada. So some love for Canada here. Absolutely no tariffs on this webinar. Here's a question for sort of, again, for both of you. This is kind of interesting. How do you pick a host? And I'm sure some brands may have the idea that their host is their VP of product, whoever he or she may be. And other brands may be more kind of open to that. So what does the hosting discussion look like, sort of from both of your angles?
Liz, I think you should start from like a general perspective because you have like a broader view, and then I
Sure.
can go in with deets.
Yeah, I always say that the host should have some stake in the content. I think for a long time in podcasting in general, but even branded podcasting, sometimes the choice was let's choose a presenter, like a radio announcer, someone who is a host. And then that came more, I think, from the radio world, but we're learning more and more that the best hosts for podcasts are the people who have some stake in the content. They have a reason to be there and a story to tell. Like Andrea, you have your own personal connection to the content for this small business. You have your own story to tell, and that people connect with that. So I think that is probably the most important qualifier for being a host. Of course, sometimes if you have the option, there are celebrities with huge followings, and their shows might get a large following right away. But I wouldn't say that that should be your first choice necessarily. Just find your story, find your stake in the content and your reason for being there, and people will connect with that.
Yeah, and I'll add from my personal experience being the host and hired to be this host. There's obviously so many ways you can go about it of who's telling that story, but just like Liz said, if there's no obvious connection and you don't feel that passion from the hosts themselves, then as a listener, why are you even going to want to listen to that as well? And I see this in like there's different grounds, but I see this in two ways. One, let's say you as a brand, you have the budget, because let's start there. You have the budget to get a celebrity host. If you have not all the case, if you find the perfect celebrity host, you have the budget and they are true to the story and they have stake in it and they want to be in it for the long haul, then that's great. Usually that takes a lot of work to be able to find that perfect person for it with that huge following, et cetera, et cetera. You can see that huge spike at the beginning, especially if you have a following on your brand and people who already love other content that you're putting out. But then there's the risk of if that person isn't true to what it is, if it doesn't feel authentic, if it doesn't feel organic, you're going to get a drop off and you're never getting those people back. On the other case of it being, maybe you have someone that is a lot more passionate about the story you're trying to tell of the brand, but they're not super well known, as it was in my case. There's a trickle effect, but then you have that opportunity to learn about your audience. What's working, what's not. You get that opportunity to finesse, and then they get to grow with you, and you're building that audience, and you're driving awareness of it at the same time. And that's the sweet spot. It will take time. It does take patience. But I think the sweet spot is finding someone who is as passionate to tell the story of your brand as you are to want to put the resources into it.
So I want to get to one more question before we have some kind of last thoughts here. And Valentina asks, how do you persuade a company to make a branded podcast if they are hesitant? Top tips. And I think the kind of corollary or related question to that is, should everyone do a branded podcast? And what kind of a company would you politely say, meh, maybe this isn't for you, which I'm sure is something, Liz, that you've run across.
Yeah, I definitely think branded podcasts are not for everyone. If you're looking to make sales in the short term, probably not the best medium. Maybe advertising on a podcast would be a better option, and a better place to put your money. I would say nothing is impossible when it comes to podcasts. And, there are a lot of people who talk about being able to convert listeners into customers. And I think it does work, but it's a long game. So if you're looking for short-term sales, I would say maybe it's not the best option. Try newsletter marketing, try podcast advertising, something along those lines. But if you're looking to build a real meaningful connection, with an audience who's maybe not yet ready to buy your product, or maybe doesn't even yet know that you or your product exists, but you want to get on their radar and you want to build a relationship with them now so that when they're ready to buy, you're top of mind. I would say that would be the right choice for you, a branded podcast.
So, any last thoughts here before we wrap up about what branded podcasts mean to you, or the future of branded podcasts, or even what you're going to do later today? Any last thoughts?
Andrea?
I think for me, it's two things, or I guess like one with an extension to it. I think branded podcasts have so much potential if done right and with intention. And what I mean by that is people don't want content for the sake of content. Like, oh, we don't have a podcast, let's do one. It has to be good content. And I think brands have the opportunity to show up in ways that feel fresh and meaningful. But to do that, you need to go beyond presence. You need to provide value. And for that, you need to know what they value. And for that, you need to know who they are. And one of the things I feel like I'm always repeating myself when we talk about this internally is this is not just about brand awareness, which are two words that like come up a lot when thinking about why you want to create a podcast as a brand. It can't just be about like, look, here's another place where we show up and you letting your customers about that, but it's about creating something that people genuinely want to spend time with. And then that's how, and as all the things we've spoken about today, that's what leads to brand loyalty and ultimately what you would like.
Yeah. And I personally think there's a lot of unexplored territory in branded podcasting. I see a lot of branded podcasts showing up in a similar way with similar topics they want to discuss in a similar format. I think for brands that are courageous and playful and excited to experiment with maybe different formats or reaching different audiences than necessarily like the C-suite, there's a huge opportunity, and it's just a matter of finding the right niche.
Well, I want to thank Andrea from This Is Small Business. Please check out that podcast. They're partners of Sounds Profitable. And a special thanks to Liz and Roger and everybody from Jar Audio who helped to make this presentation possible. We're always trying to provide value for the podcast industry. We can only do it with partners like you. On behalf of Sounds Profitable and Lauren from our team who's on here, and Brian and Gavin, thank you so much for the gift of your time and attention. And we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks, Tom.